All right. Hey, all. The subject of this lecture is going to be topicality in particular. So it'll be about 45 minutes long. This is going to lay kind of the full groundwork for some of the deeper dives we're going to do tomorrow on topicalities applied to this year's topic. This lecture is instead going to kind of focus mostly on the kind of topicality as an argument, the theory, the execution of it, etc. In particular, it is incredibly important that everyone watch this and kind of, fully understand all of it so that we can be 100% on the same page about all the stuff going into all the business we're going to dig into tomorrow. So I'm going to move through things pretty quickly because there's a lot of stuff I want to cover. Obviously, you can pause, rewind, rewatch, etc. But in particular, there are two things I want to flag at the outset. The first is, if any of you have any questions at all that occur to you as you watch this, if you're watching this on Monday evening, jot them down and then be sure to ask them. Specifically, Miles is going to be available from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. tonight, either via Zoom or Slack. It's up to you. If you're watching this on Tuesday, then same thing. Make sure you write it down. Make sure you ask us. But bring your questions to lab with you. Definitely do not feel deterred from asking things. Second, if as I go through some of this, especially the kind of introductory basic stuff, you're like, oh, I already know all this, watch it all anyway. I am very confident there will be things said during it that'll still be useful and important to you, no matter how experienced you are or are not, that you don't already know. Last thing is, would definitely strongly recommend that you take notes. So all of that out of the way, quick roadmap. I'm first gonna kind of go through and discuss, starting kind of, the most foundational level, but then working my way up through the theory of what's going on with topicality, and in particular, also spend, particularly focus on kind of what makes a definition relatively better or worse. The lion's share of that discussion is going to end up being about predictability in particular, in ways that will be very important for all the discussions we'll have tomorrow. The second chunk is going to be kind of a few tips for deployment of topicality in actual debates for the end that'll be useful for some of the speeches and mini debates and stuff that y'all will also do in lab tomorrow. So all that being said, without further ado, the first thing that I want to talk about briefly is what topicality is and kind of where it comes from. Many of you are probably familiar, either even if only kind of briefly and in passing, with the idea of stock issues, i.e. there being a set of kind of fundamental burdens that the affirmative has to fulfill. So if you go back into the 80s, the way that a lot of this was understood was that the affirmative had several different burdens that it had to uphold. It had to be, there had to be an identifiable problem with the status quo, i.e. inherency. That harm had to be significant. The affirmative had to have, plausibly solve it. And then topicality is the other one of those. Now, the reason that is important, and the reason I'm starting here, is that it gets at the core idea that topicality is grounded in the burden of proof. The AF has to, the AF has burden of proof for upholding the resolution. I'll talk about that more in a second, versus the neg's burden of rejoinder, right? So the affirmative, put differently, the affirmative's win condition is proving the resolution true. Now, there are many different ways that one might go about doing that, and over the decades, there were, some big paradigm wars in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then again in the 90s. Should the AF have to win that the entire resolution is not true, or and what does proof entail? The place where it has ended up for policy debates is with what you will often hear referred to as people parametricizing the resolution, i.e. the AF typically picks a single example of the res, and the whole debate then becomes about whether that particular instance, i.e. the plan, is a good or bad idea. But in order for that model to make any sense, it must first be the case that that plan is in fact an example that proves the resolution true, and that the plan is, so the plan is that and is only that, which we'll get back to when we get to extra T in a bit. So put differently, if you imagine the resolution as a circle, the AF stakes out kind of a specific point within that circle, and that point must be wholly within the circle. It can't be on the boundary, it can't be partially within and partly outside. And the AF then wins if they win that one particular plan is a good idea. That then also is the reason this is a voting issue, right? Because the affirmative has otherwise failed to meet their burden. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But so that kind of quick intro out of the way. I think that first and foremost, one of the things that is incredibly important as you're thinking about T strategically is kind of its use as a filter. The very first thing I did when we started to dive into this topic was to do a T-file, right? Like go and spend a bunch of hours cutting cards on what each one of the words and phrases in the resolution mean. Because if you don't know what all those words mean and the various key points of kind of contestation in what those words mean, you obviously, you cannot proceed in a strategically well-founded way in terms of figuring out what sets of offensive options are most important for you to have and what tools you most need in the toolbox. So I wanted to say that up front because I think it kind of filters the way that you should think about some of the discussions and debates and stuff that we'll have tomorrow. Now, to dig down into the nuts and bolts a little bit, first, briefly, I believe that all of you already know this, but just in case, the components of a topicality argument for the neg, first, the interpretation, i.e. you present a definition and you're like, here is what this word should be construed to mean. Second, the violation, i.e. the set of reasons that the AF, your explanation of why the AF does not meet that interpretation. And then third, the standards, the set of reasons why your interpretation is a good one. And then the voting issue, but all of that we'll talk about more in a minute. The AF answers then are first that they meet, i.e. the AF plan does in fact fall within the scope of the negatives interpretation. Second, your counter interpretation. So, the way you believe those words should be defined instead, and then the set of reasons to prefer your interpretation over theirs. Importantly, that includes both offensive and defensive components, which again, we'll unpack in more detail in a moment. So the thing that I want to talk about most, one of the things I want to talk about most is what makes a definition good, because that's kind of at the root of a lot of this, right? Like, why is your definition preferable to theirs? And I think that pretty naturally melds in with the discussion of those various standards as well. So first, to kind of briefly discuss some of the various standards and reasons to prefer the people forward. One common one is ground. So the sets of arguments available to each side. In particular, an important constituent issue of that is questions of affirmative ground versus negative ground. Which ones of those are, which of those is more important and in what forms, and does quality matter or quantity or what? So for example, typically, the way of understanding this, I think, makes the most sense is that neg ground outweighs, because the affirmative gets to pick the plan, always has some amount of ground, is always going to have something to say. But it's incredibly important, we're looping back to the initial discussion earlier of like burden of rejoinder, like in order to win the debate, the neg has to win that the AF is wrong about some set of things. So it is critical that the neg be able to say that the AF is wrong about some set of things. Seems somewhat straightforward and intuitive. Saying that a given interpretation provides the neg more ground than is important, but it also is important that that ground be high quality, right? Like even if the neg can say a lot of things, if those things they can say are, not very credible or compelling, then even if there are like disads or whatever, if those disads are terrible, then that doesn't actually, speak to a very compelling vision of debate. It also is really important that that ground be predictable, which is the thing I'll talk about more in a second. Second, limits. So when we talk about an interpretation being limiting, we are talking about it, the number of AFs and the type of AFs that it will tend to, that a given interpretation includes. And so in particular, you'll hear people often use the phrase over-limiting versus under-limiting. The kind of core question here is the size of the topic and the nature of that topic. And so, in a lot of ways, it is very much a balancing act. The risk of a big topic is that there is, can very easily be too much for the negative to keep up with, which results in kind of a certain amount of overstretch or under preparation. That can have, one of two effects or both. First, the affirmative winning a huge chunk of the time, or second, the debate's becoming pretty bad and shallow and stale as the negative is forced to instead rely on a set of generics, or in many cases, I think that one of the most important things to be thinking about here, and really with a lot of topicality arguments, is not just what do those debates look like, but rather what sets of incentives does that produce for people to do or not do research, and to what degree, right? So the problem with a topic that is under limiting is not just like, oh, the affirmative can say any of these things. It is instead the neg knows that the affirmative can say any of those things, and therefore has to spend all of their time preparing all of these other kind of process counterplans and stuff, rather than digging deep into the weeds of a given affirmative in preparation for it, or even a given set of affirmatives or like type of affirmative. And that's bad because a huge chunk of the value pedagogically of debate comes from that research process, right? I would even say the vast majority of it, and that's true in a bunch of different ways. And that's a thing we can get into in more detail some other time. But assuming that that is true, assuming that the most of what you learn from debates is from the process of kind of rigorously digging through, whether it's law reviews or Google Scholar or whatever else, and engaging with those issues, cutting cards on both sides, the sets of things, both substantively and procedurally, in terms of like testing your own beliefs and ideas and stuff that you learn from that, are critically important. And when you think about debating limits, part of your argument should revolve around that set of incentives. A couple of other things worth mentioning here are the concept of functional limits. So, one common defensive argument that the app will make is that there are functional limits that check the size. It could be true in a vacuum that the interpretation they're forwarding is somewhat delimiting, but also be the case that there are other reasons why that is not in fact how it would play out, and therefore is not a realistic concern, not realistically a major concern or objection to that vision of the topic. So this is often a place where we'll talk about the state's counterplan, right? So like, if it is true that the state's counterplan effectively limits the set of strategically viable affirmatives to only apps that have a good answer to that counterplan, i.e. ones with a real Fed key warrant, a real reason the federal government has to be the one to do it, then even if it is, then it is maybe less, concerning if criminal justice reform or whatever is defined in a way that makes it kind of more expansive and less limiting. Solvency advocates are another thing that people will often talk about there, i.e., even if it's true that there are potential scary bogey person apps that one could construct because of the relatively unlimiting nature of that interpretation, if those apps don't exist, then maybe that doesn't matter as much. I think that can be more or less compelling depending on the circumstance. That typically it's not in and of itself that good of an argument, but one thing that can make it that way, mostly because, like, when was the last time you saw somebody lose because they didn't have a real solvency advocate that aligned with the plan? But I think one thing that can make it much more compelling is if it is in a context where the lack of a good solvency advocate backing the argument being made creates a disconnect that the neg can reliably strategically exploit in some other way. So to crystallize that a little bit, one example of a slightly different, but I think related concept in some ways that you'll run into is people making the argument that, like, picks check a given issue, i.e. the ability to pick out of one part of a potential affirmative means that it is much less concerning that that potential affirmative might exist. So for example, if you imagine that, this isn't true of like y'all's current high school topic, but if you imagine that the topic had built-in a floor, i.e. that you had to, make some set of criminal justice reforms, but that you could go further than that in ways that the resolution didn't specify, then logically, one of the first kind of go-to neg strategies always in response to somebody reading an app that's like, do this criminal justice reform and this other thing, would be counterplan to just do the reform, say the other thing is bad, counterplan to just do the other thing, so criminal justice reform is bad. We'll come back to this idea here in a minute when we get to the extra topicality portion. But okay, so if ground then is about like people's ability to engage, and limits is about size, the core thing that I think is super important here, and that's going to structure a lot of the rest of what I have to say, is that neither one of those things are very compelling or good in the abstract. instead, the kind of third major standard that I think is tremendously important is predictability. And the vast majority of the time on both the AF and the neg, I think you want to be, whenever you're able, want to be framing your argument not in terms of limits or ground per se, but instead in terms of predictable limits or predictable ground, right? By that I mean, you know, even if it is true that the resolution is very bounded, maybe it is very small, but if it is not small in a way that you could reasonably have foreseen in the course of researching the topic, then it is not actually limiting the topic in any meaningful sense, right? Because you're doing all of your preparation in advance, not when you like walk into the debate and someone reads that app. Similarly, even if there are like very good, you know, if the app is like cheesecake is great and there are very good like disads to cheesecake, that is irrelevant if you could not reasonably have known in advance that that was what the debate was going to be about. Like the thing being predictable is essential. Now that you know raises the question of like what makes something predictable, and this is where I think things get you know really important. And even if you're very experienced with T, you should kind of perk up a little bit, because the answer definitely differs depending on the context, and it's obviously contestable. But the vast majority of the time, in a lot of ways, I think the best answer is what the literature based in question says about the thing. So by that I mean, you know, if you are trying to figure out like how the word reform should be defined, obviously one could, you know, cut a card from a dictionary or whatever. It's just like reform means X. But given that the topic is criminal justice reform, it is much more compelling to, you know, have like a very qualified source that is an expert in criminal justice reform saying something like, in the context of criminal justice reform, when we say the word reform, we mean X thing, right? So like one of those is, you know, even if you have like a really great dictionary definition that's like reform, when, you know, the vast majority of the time it's used means to like fix something or whatever. That is predictable insofar as understanding the word in that way is not an unreasonable thing to do. It is not predictable in the sense that like simply because that is a common meaning of the word does not mean that it is the meaning that one might most reasonably expect to be used when having an in-depth debate about the specific topic, criminal justice reform, right? So like one thing that I think that gestures at is that there are different ways of getting at what is predictable. Arguably, it is more predictable for a thing to be commonly used in that way. Arguably, it is instead more predictable, especially if the topic is like adjacent to legal stuff or connected to legal stuff, for the definition that's used to be a legally precise one, you know, from like a court case or something like that. So this brings me to another kind of critically important set of words that I would heavily encourage you to kind of integrate into the vocabulary using when debating T, but that I also think are conceptually very important, and that is precision and arbitrariness. So precision is really important in that one thing that makes something predictable, like I said a minute ago, is that it's like grounded in the literature based in question. Another thing that makes it directly related to that is like when people use a given word precisely, especially in a given context, i.e. when they mean something very specific whenever they use that word, in the sense that they use that word consistently in that way, it is pretty rare for them to mean something else when they use that word. That is a very, you know, significant factor in favor of it being a predictable way to define that word for that context. Even if, you know, that is very different from how the word would normally be understood or might be understood in some other context. Arbitrariness is somewhat related in that the core idea it gets at is, you know, when we speak of a definition being arbitrary, we mean that there's kind of like, you know, no logically coherent reason for that to be the way that we are defining that word in that context. And a great example that kind of like pulls all these threads together is, you know, if somebody were to walk in and be like, substantially means 20%, here's this court case about, you know, like taxes or whatever. There are certainly a set of arguments one could make that are pretty good, potentially, about that being important for limits or ground or whatever. But there are a couple of different levels at which it is deeply unpredictable in a way that I think makes that argument like extremely uncompelling if the app says the right sets of things in response, right? So it is extremely arbitrary. It's deeply unpredictable, first of all, to be like, this card from this tax context is going to determine the way that we understand this, very specific issue of criminal justice reform. It also is the case that, like, even beyond that, what does it mean to take a percentage of the amount of criminal justice reform, or the amount, the amount of policing that is being reformed? And so I think if you essentially, anytime that you're in a situation, well, I'll hold on to that for 1 second. One other thing a couple of other things before we move on. We can think of predictability along a couple of different vectors, right? So there's predictability of the definition, and then there's predictability, the predictability of the way you're interpreting or applying that definition, or of the violation. And so in theory, those should typically usually be the same, but they aren't necessarily always. So to kind of crystallize that a little bit, sometimes the negative will forward an interpretation that the affirmative plausibly meets, and then assert that they don't or should not be understood to meet it, right? So if the neg is like substantially means important or big or whatever, and then it's just like, you're not that, but doesn't provide any evidence that you aren't that, or if they say like substantially is 20%, but they don't provide any evidence about like, what the baseline for sentencing is, or like how much sentencing the app does or doesn't change, or if they say, restrict means prohibit, and you're like, we prohibit this thing, and they're just like, no, that's not good enough, that's not what you do. All of those, I think, are very much, real examples that are very parallel to a bunch of situations you'll find yourself in when you're AF and on the neg, are things that you should not do. Because the problem is, even if your definition is very predictable, like let's say your, restrict means X thing card is amazing and is from the, like leading expert on whatever the topic that year is, but you then are lacking any evidence that substantiates the fact that the app you're reading it against does not restrict things in that way, then even though it could be true that your definition is totally predictable and non-arbitrary and extremely defensible, it could also still be true that it is extremely unpredictable and arbitrary to vote against, to conclude that the affirmative doesn't meet it, right? To vote against the affirmative based on that argument. And this segues into the whole like reasonability versus competing interpretations discussion, and some things that I think people often kind of get wrong or miss there. Press pause on that. We'll come back to that in a minute. So one other quick note, since I mentioned some of the substantial stuff that I think is worth making here, is that because of the same arbitrariness issue, you'll certainly have plenty of judges who feel differently, but I think parsing through this conceptually is important. I would personally very strongly prefer that it be, it even be something like substantially means it's really big, if it's backed by really good cards, that in a given context, like, so that in the main thing that I said in lab earlier today, right, that substantial means a large reform to the majority, to the key main parts of the issue, which is a thing that there are very good cards for, and that in kind of a legally precise way is very often what it means. That a bunch of people are like, that can't win, that sort of argument can't win debates because there's no clear bright line, which is another kind of important phrase to run into a bunch for T, right? Like, is there a very bright line between things that are included and are not, a very clear differentiator that makes it very easy to police that line. Excuse me. And that certainly is helpful and makes the job much easier. But to kind of draw an analogy to the courts, which is definitely very heavily in, like, the legal context extremely heavily informs the language we use and the way that we understand and think about debate in general, but topicality in particular. The courts certainly do prefer to have like a bright line and be like, this thing is in, this thing is out. But there are many contexts where that just like isn't really viable. And not knowing exactly where the line is does not mean that you can't know that it has been crossed. The courts do this literally all the time. They'll be like, we don't know in for purposes of this, don't need to speak to, what percentage this happens at, but we do know that this thing goes too far, or this thing doesn't go far enough. And people, I think, are often kind of quick. Part of the reason I wanted to say this here is to get at the idea of judge intervention. People, I think, are, in response to that idea, very quick to label that, especially in debates, judge intervention. They'll be like, reject that interpretation, it's interventionist or whatever. And I think that that framing is very often acceded to by the other team. But I think it's a little bit off base in that that's not necessarily true. The thing that would make it interventionist is the judge deciding some set of arguments for themselves instead of leaving it open to debate. But instead, the focus here should be, what are the arguments in favor of defining substantially in that kind of like murky but much more policeable way, as opposed to, this like very arbitrary, unpredictable thing. And it's also worth noting that like somebody not voting on topicality is just as much making a decision as somebody who is voting on topicality. And I think that, sometime you'll certainly have a range of judging, and you should be very attentive to that. But I think that sometimes a lot of this is an issue of you, like it is very important to understand these kind of conceptual hurdles going in so that you can explain and frame your argument in ways that overcome them or deal with them. So taking a step back, a corollary to a lot of the stuff I've said so far is that a good T argument will often be backed by a stack of great cards. And that, I think, is an idea that is foreign to a lot of people sometimes and should not be. To crystallize this, one thing that I would definitely write down and kind of star that I think is helpful for thinking about some of this is, in general, if everyone on both sides is making the right set of arguments and executing on them perfectly, I would say that there are, generally speaking, probably 4 kind of broad conceptual categories of T debates. First, situations where one side has a clear and decisive edge in both how good for debate their vision of the topic would, in theory, be, so limits, ground, etc., and in terms of how kind of predictable, contextual, precise, etc. it is. In which case, obviously, if they execute things properly, like, they should win. But I think the vast majority of T debates fall into one of 3 other categories. So the second category is situations where both sides' interpretations are relatively equally well backed by great topic evidence, and thus are, largely equitably predictable, non-arbitrary, etc. Right? So like both of you have really good cards that are like, in the criminal justice context, this thing often means X. Or, it's like, there are 2 main ways this phrase is used a bunch of the time. Y'all are clashing over which one of those should be preferred. In that case, it clearly becomes and should be framed as a question of whose vision of debate is better, right? Like if you can successfully win, but like yours is more predictable and stuff than theirs, then you should, and you certainly should try to, right? Like that set of arguments and going back and forth and stuff should be going on. But if both sides are debating equally well, such that that's kind of resolved to a standstill because y'all genuinely are both in the same spot there, then the debate becomes like, which one is better? Which one's more limited? Which one has better ground? Is it more important to prioritize a topic that is narrower and more limited, even if that comes at the expense of being able to talk about some set of issues that are kind of really core to the topic and really important, or even if it kind of makes the AF's life much more difficult. We'll get to some of that stuff in a minute. But third category is both sides, like neither side has a predictable or good or very precise interpretation, right? So both sides have a stupid, like by read, arbitrary interpretation. In that situation, also the entire debate becomes about which one is better for debating reasons, right? So if they're like substantially is 20% in the tax context, and you're like substantially is 5% in the greenhouse gas emissions context, then that whole debate then is about like, other than you winning because you meet their thing, the whole debate is about like which one of whether that line should be at 5% or 15%, because y'all are both reading, providing an interpretation that is very unpredictable, has no real applicability to the criminal justice reform context. We could not reasonably ex ante see coming. That can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing. But for the most part, it does kind of speak to the idea that like when and where you're able to leverage having an advantage in terms of how high quality and predictable your definition is, you want to be doing that, because if you're doing that properly, whether on the neg or the app, if you're like exploiting it in the right ways, you will win most of the time. Which brings me to the last category, which is one side has an edge on one of those vectors and the other side has an edge on the other one, i.e. a more predictable and less arbitrary interpretation versus a better limited interpretation, or one that provides better ground or whatever. And in this case, obviously there are, for any T debate and any debate period, there are like, multiple different levels at which you want to be contesting this, right? Like if you are the person whose interpretation is in truth kind of more predictable and more precise, you obviously don't want to be ceding that premise. You want to make arguments about why yours does preserve limits or does so better, or like, the ground given to the neg is better under yours, and so on. But most importantly, you want to be making the set of arguments that are true and impacting them out in ways that mean that you win, even if they win most of their arguments. And in this case, that means, clearly and decisively establishing that yours is more predictable, more precise, less arbitrary, and why. And then doing the kind of comparative and interactive work to win the fact that your thing is more predictable, means that even if theirs is more limited or provides better ground or whatever, it doesn't matter, it still should be rejected, right? So your offense like turns theirs or outweighs theirs for various sets of reasons. We'll come back to that momentarily. I want to briefly say that there obviously, are another category of reasons why a given interpretation might be good or bad, or why it might be important or, good or bad for someone to be topical. And that is arguments related to kind of education on a given topic, things being core of the topic, et cetera. I think that the majority of the time, for me personally, these aren't all that compelling, or at least not on their own, but I think that they are important and useful, both because they are more persuasive to some judges than others, but also, and more importantly, because they provide reasons, additional kind of offensive reasons why in those cases where there is a plausible case to be made for either interpretation, it makes great sense to me that one that kind of gets to the heart of the issue is both in some ways inherently more predictable, but also, even if not, is one that is kind of like more pedagogically sound and valuable in a way that makes it worth endorsing. Next idea, which kind of builds off of all of that, is competing interpretations versus reasonability. So competing interpretations, in a nutshell, it claims that like whichever vision of debate is best should win. You'll often hear people say like, it's not what you do, it's what you justify, and stuff like that. And in a lot of ways, some of that is fairly controversial, fairly uncontroversial in the sense that, when you hear people talking about like in-round abuse or whatever, that should, in theory, for the most part, be largely irrelevant. Obviously, depends, can be useful sometimes, particularly in high school and depending on your judging. But in terms of what kind of fundamentally, at least in my view, makes the most sense, all that really should matter is the hypothetical piece. And the reason for that is because the negative should never be in a position of being, reliant on kind of the app being magnanimous, right? Like neg should never be beholden to app generosity. Relatedly, but taking a step back, the other kind of like, other than competing interpretations, the thing that the other kind of alternative is reasonability. And it is worth noting that one of the kind of core origins of this debate is that it grew out of, there's a period of time, I want to say it was like in the 90s, don't quote me on that, where the neg was kind of increasingly going for and winning with marginally more limited interpretations simply because they were theoretically slightly better. This even got so stupid that people were providing interpretations for which they were reading no cards. In a lot of cases, they were just like, this way of understanding this word would be smaller by 1/2 or whatever, so it should go away. When you hear people say, if you've ever heard someone say like counter interpretation, only my app is T or something like that, this is the idea that they're getting at, that like it being arbitrary is a deal breaker, because you could always, literally always have an interpretation that is better. That is mostly irrelevant. The question is not like, is it, better in whatever way, right? Like if you care about it being big, you can always have a bigger one. If you care about it being small, you can always have a smaller one. If you care about one where the neg has better DAs, that's always possible. There's always a word or a way of narrowing or expanding that definition of that word slightly that would make it a little bit better. But that's irrelevant because of the kind of predictability and arbitrariness stuff we've already talked about. Which brings me to reasonability, because I think that this often is like pretty poorly understood. You'll hear people say stuff like good is good enough. And that is one way of framing this, and does get at something important, which is that like if we're able to have the idea that if we're able to have a debate, then we should have a debate, right? The original kind of a couple of decades ago, the original purpose of T was much more just like make a debate possible, and much less the kind of like strategic tool in the toolbox, just like any other argument way that it's typically understood now. That can be worth an argument worth making, in part for reasons I'll discuss more in a sec. But one alternative kind of frame or way of thinking about this that I would forward is thinking about reasonability as essentially a disad to voting on an interpretation that is more arbitrary or less predictable or precise. So much like comparing your interpretation to theirs, all of this should be couched in terms of what debate would look like, right? And so, there's both the layer that's like, under their interpretation, if everyone adopted it, what would debate look like? Same thing for yours. But there's also the layer, once you start factoring in some of that predictability stuff, et cetera, of like, if a world in which the neg could win, despite the fact that the AF's interpretation has pretty equitable division of ground, is very much a way that people in the context of the topic understand that word, and so on. If the AF can be handed an outright loss, like, given the competitive death penalty, simply because there was another way of interpreting that word that is also frequently used in that literature base, that is like a little bit more limited or has a little bit better ground, that is a world that heavily incentivizes, debates becoming entirely about that most of the time. That's like the substance crowd out idea that you'll hear people refer to, or at least it's like what the warrant for that should be. It also, though, is just kind of like deeply problematic if you think about all of this through the frame, like we said earlier, of like, what is the purpose of T? What are the incentives it's producing, et cetera, right? You want something that facilitates in-depth research and clash and stuff on a given topic. You want something that ensures that the AF and neg both, are able to be kind of relatively equitably prepared. And when you are comparing two interpretations and one is like a little bit better than the other one, voting based solely on that fact, if and only if the AF is doing a good job of explaining why that's like a bad way to make that decision, is objectionable. There's an article on this that I'm going to attach to this lecture that I would heavily recommend people read. Running short on time, I'm going to run through a few other important things real quick, and then we'll wrap this up. So first, I want to flag that a couple of other concepts which you should be familiar. A is effects T. So something being effects topical is when the plan is not topical in and of itself, but rather claims to be topical by virtue of, as the name suggests, its effects, right? By virtue of the things in which it claims to result. The way of preventing this is to think of topicality through the lens of the plan in a vacuum. So the plan itself on face, prima facie, has to be T. So to clarify that a little bit, you can't be like, the US should pressure, or like people should lobby Congress to get Congress to pass some reform. The plan needs to actually do the reform itself. So why is this bad? Why is this objectionable? Number one, it in a very real sense kind of obliterates limits. It's impossible to effectively police like the plan does this reform or doesn't do this reform if because it makes it probabilistic. Like maybe the plan will have that effect, maybe it won't, who knows? And if you go far enough back up the chain, you can always claim, whether it's more or less credible, that something will cause something, will cause something, will cause something, will cause a topical result. And so totally delimits stuff. Second, as I kind of alluded to a second ago, you can't really adjudicate it without reference to solvency. This is where the phrase mixing burdens comes in. So, that showed up in your diagnostic earlier. Mixing burdens refers to when the lines become blurred between solving and being topical. Those questions are always, this is very important and fundamental to T and what makes, to the nature of T. Those are very separate questions. One is the plan itself within that circle that is the resolution? Solvency is a question of effectiveness that is totally unrelated. The implication of this is that one thing that makes a definition bad is if it mixes burdens in this way, right? So if it's like substantial means impactful, or like, to reform some, this is what gets tricky about defining reform on this topic. To reform something being to like, make it better or whatever, it's like, okay, well then if you don't, have you reformed it? And the lines are more or less blurry in different contexts, but for the most part, you want to keep those things as separate as possible. So point B is extra topicality, which refers to the idea that even if the plan in a vacuum is topical, it has additional elements that are not topical. So, maybe like if you, in a very extreme kind of like straw person-y form, if you like reformed sentencing and like, passed a trade deal or whatever, you aren't strictly speaking non-topical in the sense that you do have an entire topical plan, but you have another chunk of it that is severable, that is, does not affirm the topic. And for time reasons, not going to get into like, why that's objectionable. If you have any questions about that or whatever, very happy to talk, just reach out. Last few things. Number one, so like looping back to what makes a definition good. One major takeaway from stuff we've already talked about is it being predictable and precise. Obviously, how it being more or less limited, what sorts of limits and ground it provides are very important questions, and we'll get into that more in the coming days. But another thing that I think it's incredibly important to forefront here is intent to define, right? So a card that is like X means Y is what is necessary to have a real interpretation. If you are, in most cases, if you are reading a card, if your interpretation card is like, just uses the word or phrase contextually to suggest something, that, most of the time isn't going to be good enough. It's not going to cut it because it doesn't establish that somebody intended for that word to mean that thing. And instead was just like somebody used this way sometime, which connects back to all our predictability, arbitrariness stuff, et cetera. Another crucial thing here, it's directly related, is intent to exclude, or alternatively to include, right? So if somebody isn't, it is incredibly important and valuable to have evidence that's like X is in bounds or X is not in bounds, right? So like you want to have both a card that's like reform means X thing. Then you want to have another card that's like X is not a reform, or reform does not include X thing. If you have both of those and they gel together, then you're in really good shape. And it establishes that this limit that you're drawing is a very precise one, and therefore, a predictable one, and a policeable one as well. On that note, quick kind of forward-looking thought. So we're gonna dig into a bunch of different T stuff tomorrow. One quick kind of example or allusion to some stuff that you'll engage with is T enact. So like, what does it mean to enact? Usually when the word enact is used, at least in a legal context, it very precisely means to an act of the legislature, as opposed to the court or the president. There certainly are people who use the word enact in passing, referring to the courts. There are also people who engage this idea directly and are like, that's not how it's understood, or it shouldn't be. And so you'll often end up with it. So like, in theory, we'll end up with a set of arguments that are legal precision as a basis versus some other way that we should understand what is predictable or precise for criminal justice. and then, and how much that matters. And then ground and limits arguments about, the affirmative can already say all kinds of stuff, it's very hard to be neg, et cetera. Ground and limits arguments against including the courts and kind of further dramatically expanding that list, versus a set of arguments in favor of including the court, such as topic education, a bunch of court cases that are obviously extremely relevant for criminal justice reform, or the difficulty of finding a good answer to some of the core topic counterplans. States, prosecutors just shouldn't charge people against sentencing apps, and so on. Last couple of quick thoughts. First, in terms of like thinking about the speeches and debates tomorrow, I think it's useful to think about topicality like any other argument in some ways. You'll sometimes hear people say that T is a disad. What they mean by that is the following. The violation, in theory, is your link, right? You must establish that you have a link. You must establish that the plan violates your interpretation. And then your standards must connect to impacts. And those impacts must outweigh theirs, right? And so I think the core lesson there that's most important is that, as with any argument, always, you have to explain why your offense comparatively net outweighs theirs, right? So like mitigate theirs and then do the work of comparing how much of yours is left versus how much of theirs is left and why that is most important. More than anything else, that is the thing to keep in mind as you figure out how to like write those speeches tomorrow. Additionally, the issue of a case list, what things does your vision of the topic include, what things does it exclude? And relatedly, like, is the topic so small that it's going to get stale, that we won't have fun, interesting new things to say, that we won't be able to read new apps? Like, that sounds pretty terrible to me. Or is it, kind of so broad that there aren't, that there's no kind of reasonable outer bound on how many there are. A lot of these things, and whether those cases are real and credible and worth thinking about, are kind of helped significantly by being, not just like listing rattling off a list of cases, but instead being like, here are the sorts of things that are allowed in or are excluded, and here's why that's like good or bad, or sufficient or not. Last, number one, keep in mind that your judge has limited pin time when you're making T arguments. Don't just like rattle off a bunch, especially if you're unclear. Don't be insane. Like, make sure that your arguments are being communicated. Second, and directly relatedly, be efficient, but also very communicative, right? So front load punchy tags always that get at your argument. It's a good idea and important all the time, but especially on T, where for each one of those, being like, one, we meet, 2 or 3 word like blip that gets at why, that's true. And then like, sentence or phrase explanation is much better than like, I'm just going to read this sentence at you. All right, I think that covers it. We look forward to seeing you all in lab tomorrow. Definitely ask any questions y'all might have. Look out for the topicality file for this topic that's forthcoming here in the next few minutes as well, and we will debate all this stuff out.